Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Harborne Islamic Study Circle HISC Seerah session 129. Inshallah, this will be the third and final one on Banu Quraiza and incidents or learnings associated with Banu Quraiza. As we talked in the last couple of sessions, Banu Quraiza, that happened immediately after the victory of the Battle of the Trench, or the Battle of the Allied armies, the Confederates, Al-Ahzab and Khandaq. So the night of the Ahzab, the Quraysh and Ghatafan, they all fled. In the morning, Prophet ﷺ and the army, they cleared up, they got home after Dhuhr time. And then the Prophet ﷺ was instructed by Jibreel alayhi salam to, the Prophet ﷺ was instructed by Jibreel alayhi salam to not take off his armor, but to go immediately to Banu Quraiza and to deal with their treachery. So he made an announcement that nobody should pray Asr until they get to Banu Quraiza. That was the backdrop. Then the Prophet ﷺ and the army, they camped out for about 25 days, laying siege to Banu Quraiza, which was the last of the three Jewish tribes from Medina. And then Banu Quraiza, after 25 days, agreed to surrender. Unconditional surrender is what the Prophet ﷺ demanded, and that's eventually what they had to agree to. And so the people from the Ansar, they surrounded the Prophet ﷺ and said, look, go easy on him, give them the same judgment as you gave the other Jewish tribes. And then there was some toing and froing, and the Prophet ﷺ then agreed to say, look, will you guys be happy if one of your own people made pronounced judgment, the verdict? So would you guys be happy if I appoint an independent judge to adjudicate the fate of Banu Quraiza? And they said, yeah, fine. And they said, fine, I'll choose for you Saad ibn Muath. And Saad ibn Muath was injured, had an arrow that severed one of his main arteries or veins, and he was being nursed by Rufayda in the field hospital tent, which was set up in the Prophet's masjid. And so then Saad ibn Muath was directed to come from his hospital bed to the front line where general headquarters were, and the Prophet ﷺ had his tent and his canopy as the leader of the Muslims, laying siege. And as Saad was being brought in, the Prophet ﷺ ordered his tribesmen, the Aus, because the matter technically didn't need to have the Muhajirun or the Khazraj involved, because the Aus were the main allies of Banu Quraiza in the times before Islam. So the Prophet ﷺ told the Aus to stand up for the leader, and this was the only time that we know of where the Prophet ﷺ instructed people to stand up for someone. Then the Aus, obviously, where they were again jostling for attention from Saad, and they wanted him to be lenient. And then Saad said, basically, I'm going to make judgment that will keep Allah and His Messenger happy. And so then he got agreement from his tribespeople that they obey him, got agreement from the other Muslims and the Prophet ﷺ that they would accept his verdict. And then his verdict was that the men should be executed, the women and children taken captive, and the wealth distributed. And this was because, despite 3 times signing up for the peace agreement, the truce, they betrayed that agreement on this occasion, and this was such a level of betrayal where there was a pure existential threat to the whole of Medina, and you had 10,000 troops amassed outside, ready to invade, and the plot was that as they would invade from the north and the northwest of Medina, the Khazraj, they would launch a counteroffensive from the south, and possibly go one side towards where the women and children were in the fortress, and the other sides towards the Muslims. Thereby, the Muslims would be in a classic pincer movement. But obviously, that plan was foiled partly because of the trench, and then Allah is the best planner. But because they had ripped up the treaty and thrown it back in the face of the envoys of the Prophet ﷺ, and they declared the treaty null and void, there was really no other verdict that was appropriate. And again, we'll come back on to the appropriateness of the verdict. Then we talked last week about how some of the Jewish elders were from Banu Quraiza and from Banu Nadir. They were led away to be executed. We talked about Huyay bin Akhtab, the leader of Banu Nadir, who said basically, I've got no regrets, and in all his pomp and ceremony, and he knows that he has been humiliated by Allah. And he said that straight out to the Prophet's face. And then Qa'b bin Asad, the leader of Banu Quraiza, he said, look, I know you're the Prophet. I want to believe you. I want to follow you. But I don't want to convert because my people would think I'm a coward. I'm fearing death rather than following you. So he feared for his legacy, and he had this tribalism as well within himself. So he wasn't true to truth and justice. He got his just rewards, and he was executed. There was one woman who was executed because she'd thrown a big millstone on top of a Sahabi and killed him. And then we had the strange story of Thabit ibn Qasim, who returned a favor to Zubair, who had saved him during the Battle of Mu'adh, and then Zubair gets freed as an old man. His family get freed, he gets given back his wealth, but then when Zubair finds out that all the other elders and all his friends essentially have already been executed, because he's sort of very down on the pecking list of the execution. They start with the higher ups, the nobles, the VIPs, and they work their way down. He said, look, there's no point in being alive if everyone else is dead. So then he agrees to be executed despite having the offer of freedom with his family and his wealth intact, without having to convert to becoming a Muslim. So then the spoils are distributed, and we talked about how the cavalry get greater share than infantry, and the fifth go to the Prophet ﷺ in the Baitul Mal. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he invited Rihana to become a Muslim. So that's essentially how it finished. But there are a couple of important things just to pick up from Banu Quraiza in terms of the lessons that we can learn. But just to finally finish off the story, we talked about Saad ibn Muath, and very shortly after this, perhaps within a few days, Saad, he passed away. Now, Saad, as I say, he was the one the Prophet ordered the Sahabi to stand up for. And when he passed away, the well-known hadith of the Prophet said that this is the righteous servant for whom the throne of Allah shook. Again, and we're not aware, it's not recorded anywhere, that happened for the death of anyone else. That incident essentially was as they were burying him, and again another report is they're taking his body in for the janaza to al-Baqi, and the Sahabi says, they said, look, we've never carried someone lighter than this. Right, so as we know, the tradition is that the Muslims they would carry the dead body once it's been washed and wrapped on their shoulders to the graveyard, and they're saying, look, basically it was like carrying nothing. It was light as a feather, is the term that we would use. And the Prophet said, well, why shouldn't it be light? For verily 70,000 angels came down, and these angels have never come down to earth before except for this, and they were carrying the body with you, hence it was so light. When Saad was being buried, the Prophet said to him, as they're lowering the body, Jazakallah khairan, O leader of the people, you have fulfilled your promise to Allah, and Allah will fulfill his promise to you. So as they're then lowering the body into the grave, the Prophet ﷺ starts saying Subhanallah, and all the Sahabi then respond Subhanallah, and the whole of Baqi says Subhanallah, and then he said Subhanallah, Subhanallah, third time, and then the Prophet ﷺ said Allahu Akbar, and then the Sahabi obviously responded in kind, and then they asked him, well, you started off saying Subhanallah, and then you said Allahu Akbar, why the change? And the Prophet ﷺ said, again, this is a lovely hadith, that this righteous servant, referring to Saad ibn Muath, for whom the throne of Allah shook, and for whom 70,000 angels came down to witness his shahada. Again, he was granted shahada because he received his mortal wound during the Battle of the Ditch. He has now been squeezed in the grave and then set free. And if anyone were to have been free from the squeezing of the grave, it would have been Saad. And we talked about this, before in when we did the journey of the soul, the life after death, the Sakratul Maut, the agony of dying, the journey to the grave, what happens in the grave, and the very first thing, and you can see this is as the body is being laid down, and the earth is being put on the body in whatever dimension this happens, but the body squeezes really hard. The body gets squeezed really hard by the soil, and again, partly because we're made from soil, we're from clay, soil, and dirt. So when we get put in the grave at the end of our life, the earth is welcoming us back and giving us a welcome hug, as it were. And it's a tight, really compressing, squeezing, welcome back hug. And again, it's in the dimensions where the ruh is, but it's happening at that point in time, just as the body is being lowered. And then we previously then talked about how the ruh can hear the footsteps of people walking away, and then when the angels come and they ask the three questions, so that's all happening as the body is being put in freshly, and then the ruh of the righteous believer comes out of the body like water from a jug, gets taken up to the heavens, and Allah verifies that it's a righteous being, and comes back down, gets put in the grave, and the evil person, their soul gets ripped out like a branch, thorns through wet wool or cotton, and gets and Allah sort of condemns it to its fate in the grave. So the Prophet I'm saying, look, if anyone was going to be spared that squeezing of the grave, it would have been someone like Saad. But Subhanallah, Allahu Akbar, when it was released the Prophet ﷺ, changed his tone. And Saad, he was 37 when he died. So this is about 5 years into Islam being in Medina. So he was, and then he'd become Muslim a couple of years before that. He was one of the first ones that Musab ibn Umair converted, and so so he's been a Muslim less than a decade, and he achieved so much in that time, subhanallah. So a couple of other points then to talk about related to Banu Quraiza. One is claims that this was a really harsh punishment, and the Prophet and Muslims are anti-Semitic, and the accusation is that people refer to this, and the other one is the fiqh issues related to the hadith about Banu Quraiza, which virtually all Muslims know, certainly learned Muslims know, and so just on the question of anti-Semitism, and I've listened to some of the things online, some of the accusations, and really they're very incoherent. They don't make sense, and they're often self-contradictory in their allegations, with highly selective reading of the books of Seerah, and completely taking things out of context. And the important thing that we need to realize, and we did this 3-4 years ago in the study circle, where we talked about Islam and how it's against anti-Semitism. So it's how it's, how the Muslims are, their origins are Semitic. So to accuse us of being anti-Semitic is unreasonable, and also how throughout the whole of Jewish history, from the time of the Prophet ﷺ right up until sort of the middle of the last century, thanks to colonialism, the bulk of the Jewish people lived very peacefully under Muslim rule, under Muslim laws, and in whatever Khilafah that it was, whether it was in Spain, North Africa, the Central Asia. The Jewish people, they called the time living under the Khilafah as their golden age. Now the Prophet, the punishment, he didn't enact the punishment. He appointed an independent judge from their own tribe, not Banu Quraiza's tribe, but from the tribe that were allied to Banu Quraiza. So it was their own leader, and he made the judgment himself. So the Prophet didn't make the judgment firstly. And the judgment was essentially because of what they did rather than who they were. And that's the difference. We don't, or we shouldn't, discriminate against people, have a sense of prejudice for people because of who they are. It's our relationship is with what they do to us, their actions related to us, and certainly with the Muslims, what their beliefs are. And in no way in this story is it anything to do with the fact that the Prophet ﷺ was targeting these people purely because of who they were. This is purely down to what they did. They broke the treaty, they tore it up, they conspired against the enemies in war, and they were planning to fight the Muslims. Things didn't pan out as they were, but they were essentially, the judgment was based on their actions. And again, to reiterate that, the Prophet had nothing against the Jews per se. Those few Jewish people who converted to Islam, they were able to keep their wealth, their properties, and their family. No questions asked. The story of the person who left Banu Quraiza the night before the judgment, night before the surrender, and he met Muhammad bin Maslama, and essentially he was just let go, and he spent that the next day in Medina. The Muslims weren't charged to go out and go and find him because he's Jewish. No, but it's he was just let go. So this wasn't an attack on people because of who they were, because of their Jewishness or their ethnicity. This was basically they'd broken the treaty, they'd conspired with the enemies to destroy the Muslims and the people of Medina. So therefore, the judgment needed to be appropriate to that. Islam is not one of those religions that sort of always preaches turn the other cheek, because if you turn the other cheek always, you're going to get taken advantage of. So it strikes the balance between generally as a rule being merciful, but on occasions when it's necessary, it's there to be hard against the enemies of Islam, who have no good intention towards the Muslims. So it balances those things perfectly well. And sometimes you've got to be, harsh, and you've got to be strict with people who push you around. Otherwise, people are just going to walk over you. But the general rule is Islam is merciful, but there are occasions where you've got to be strict. And again, the leaders of Ka'b bin Asad of the tribe, they knew this, they expected this, they knew nothing less than this would happen, and it's even in their own books. And the Muslim scholars have explained that this is even in the Torah, in the Deuteronomy, the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 20, I think verse 10 to 14 or so, where according to them, their God said, when you march up and attack a city, make its people an offer of peace, and if they accept it and open their gates, all the people shall be subject to forced labor and work for you. Okay, so slightly different tinge there. If they surrender, they will be your slaves, essentially. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, then they siege to the city. And when the Lord your God delivers it to your hand, put the sword to all the men in it. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder, spoils for yourselves, and you may use the plunder the Lord gives you from your enemies. So this is in their own biblical sources, that you lay siege and you kill all of the menfolk, and everything else is for you. And so again, this is the hukum that they would have expected. And subhanAllah, the Prophet ﷺ, when Saad gave that verdict, the Prophet said, this is the verdict that Allah would have wanted. So again, that relates to the second issues that I wanted to talk about in terms of learning the lessons, and that are the fiqh, the Islamic jurisprudent lessons from the issue of Banu Quraiza, and they are really important. Hence, just going to spend 10 or so minutes talking about that. And again, it's one of the first hadith that I came across 30 odd years ago when I'm studying fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence. When you're studying Sharia, everybody knows about the story of Banu Quraiza, where the Prophet said, don't pray Asr until you get there. So that can be interpreted in two ways: literal or implied, or rational, that you could say. So When the Prophet made the announcement and told the Mu'adhin to announce to the people of Medina, do not pray Asr until you get to Banu Quraiza. Some people left immediately when they heard that. This was, after Dhuhr time. And other people, they had to, go back, get their armor, put their armor back on, get their horses, their camels or your saddles, and go to Banu Quraiza or walk there. And again, that can take some time because it's slightly out of the city center. And so the famous incident is where you've got a group of Muslims. They're heading to Banu Quraiza as per the instructions of the Prophet ﷺ. And again, they know they've got a bit of time because they're not under attack. They're the ones who are going to be doing the attacking, and Ali ibn Abi Talib, he's already there. So they know that. But they have to go to Banu Quraiza, and then the Prophet ﷺ had explicitly said, do not pray Asr until you get to Banu Quraiza. So there's a group of Sahabis. Some of the people, they take it at face value, that we are not allowed to pray Asr until we get to Banu Quraiza. Others, they take the implied meaning, and the implied meaning is that essentially you hurry up. Don't dilly-dally, don't sort of procrastinate. Just hurry up, get there as fast as you can. And the time is short, so make sure you hurry up. So a group of Muslims, the sun was setting, and they could see that, and there's still some distance from Banu Quraiza, and so an argument broke out amongst the group of Sahabi, and these are qualified, Sahabi. They are companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and they know Islam. So an argument, a good-natured argument broke out. What should we do? If we don't pray now, the sun will set and we'll miss Asr, right? So on the one hand, you've got the hukm of Allah, you have to pray 5 times a day, you have to pray Asr. And on the other hand, the Prophet ﷺ, again, his word is law, so he's saying, do not pray Asr until you get to Banu Quraiza. So they've got to reconcile these two things, and he could have only meant one thing. He can't mean both different versions, both literal and metaphorical. So the group of Sahabi, they made Ijtehad, and they're qualified to do that. And some of them said, basically, what he meant is that we should hurry up. And the other group said, no, what we have an obligation to pray now. He meant hurry up, but we have an obligation to pray Asr. We're going to miss Asr. The others took it literally at face value. We cannot pray Asr until we get there. So one group of the Sahabi, they literally prayed as the sun was setting. They prayed Asr there and then, and they said, look, we need to, we're on the way there, but we're going to miss Asr. And the other group, they waited for that group to finish praying. It's not as if they left them alone. They waited for them to finish. They prayed their Asr, they joined together, and then the group carried on. They got to Banu Quraiza, and then the second group, they prayed their Asr once they got there. And again, this was probably in the time of Maghrib, and they obviously, prayed their Maghrib together. So when they, met up with the Prophet ﷺ, they asked him, look, this dispute happened. Did you literally mean it? Or did you just mean hurry up? And the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't criticize any of them, right? He just accepted. He accepted the Ijtehad, the verdict that both groups had given. Obviously, one group was right or closer to the truth, or as the Prophet says in other hadith, had hit the mark, right? So, for example, when you've got a bow and arrow and you're shooting the bow and arrow, the analogy is, both judgments hit the target, but one is closer to the bullseye. Okay, and so and again, the Prophet he talks in other hadith, if a qualified ruler, and it also implies a judge, judges, and that is correct, he gets 2 rewards. And if he is incorrect, he will get 1 reward. Again, that's implying that there is a right way of interpreting things and a wrong way of interpreting things. However, if he does it with all sincerity, proper ijtihad, he's qualified to do it and does it with all sincerity, and he firmly believes that this is the hukm of Allah for him, right, as a scholar, then he still gets 1 reward, even if he doesn't hit the bullseye, right? So he's done his, and again, ijtihad comes from the root verb jahada, jihad, to strive, and he strives his utmost to get the right opinion, right? He puts aside all his own inner desires, his own inner benefits, and he strives his hardest to interpret the text of Allah, Qur'an, Sunnah, Ijma, Sahaba, Qiyas, strives his hardest to get the single most opinion which he firmly believes is the hukm of Allah related to that issue. Then he gets 2 rewards if he gets it right, 1 reward if he gets it wrong. Obviously, if he is doing things to find loopholes in Islam, if he is doing things to please the ruler, make life easy for people, right, and come up with hukm based on that, then that is probably far from hitting the mark. Okay, and then you have a lot of people today, they would like to follow these people, right, who make things easy for them, but they, and they just say, well, this is what the scholar has said, without even using a bit of their own gumption on it, because at the end of the day, all of our neck is on the line for the actions that we take and the decisions we make. And if we decide to follow dodgy opinions, when we know in our heart of hearts that actually it's probably a dodgy opinion, but such and such a so-called scholar has said this, I'll follow it. You're not following what you genuinely think Allah wants you to do in that situation. You are following your desires. In that circumstances, it's unlikely that your intention is true, the motivation is right, and that you will get rewarded for that. So even if you are trying to fob it off, well, it's the scholar's fault. It's your decision to follow that scholar, and if the basis for you choosing that scholar or that opinion is your ease or your financial security, or bigging you up, then you're doing it for the wrong reasons. So that's your criteria for choosing that scholar or that scholar's opinion. If your criteria for choosing a scholar or a scholarly opinion is that you honestly think that the usul that they use are the best usul to extract the best hukm, which is likely to be the closest to what Allah wants us to do, then you're in a very different position on the Day of Judgment to someone who's just basically following their desires and coming up with, going to these DIY scholars, and their easy opinions, who will, if you look hard enough, you will find scholars who essentially even claim to allow alcohol, who claim to allow interest or mortgages, who allow all of these things which we all know not allowed, right? People can justify anything if that is what their heart wants. So again, it goes back to another principle in Islam where you're not a true believer until your very intentions are in line with the Qur'an and Sunnah, your thoughts, your ideas, right? So it's a really fundamental aspect, right? That in Islam we don't have a monolithic approach to the law, right? We should have a monolithic approach to the aqidah, the beliefs of Islam. And so for aspects of belief, we take things which are definite. Again, this is, the Arabic term is qat'i, right? It needs to be definite in text and definite in its meaning. Qat'i thubut and qat'i dalala, right? So essentially Qur'an and hadith mutawatir, and where the meaning of those texts is explicit and not open to ambiguity. Those aspects, they're the criteria, those aspects we take into our belief, and we don't question the belief if it comes through that sense. Your ilm al-ghaib, you don't rationalize it, right? The knowledge of the unseen is not rationalized. Or what are the angels? Where are the angels? How do they live? What do they look like? Right? How can you have 70,000 angels, carrying the dead body of Saad, right? So we don't rationalize it using our, four dimensions of existence. It happens, we accept it. As it's written in the language Allah has used to express it, we just take it as that, right? And we don't build beyond that. So that's issues of Aqidah. When it comes to issues of fiqh, of laws, and the how to do things, then you are allowed to have, as this instance of Banu Quraiza demonstrates, we are allowed to have ikhtilaf, difference of opinion. It is valid, it is acceptable. There is only one correct opinion, and again, the issues around differences of opinion and legal precedence, it is predicated on another term in Arabic called ghalabat adh-dhann, the least amount of doubt, or in mathematical terms, the highest probability. Okay, so all of these qualified scholars, they strive to the utmost to get what they think is the most genuine opinion to the highest probability. That this is what Allah wants us to do. But they will always say this is never 100%. There's there is, because it's not qat'i dalala all the time, the elements of fiqh can have some ambiguity, or it can be interpreted in different ways, right? So the Prophet ﷺ, or the Qur'an even says that a woman should wait 3 periods, and is that your menses, or is it your period of purity? And there's about 15 to 20 days difference on whether you take the period as being referring to menses or your period of purity. So there's ambiguity even in a legal text from the Qur'an. So for those elements, there is likely to be different scholars interpreting things slightly differently, and that is allowed, and that's one of the beauties of Islam, is it does allow that flexibility in interpretation. But the important thing is that whatever opinion we choose that we think is what Allah wants us to do, we don't criticize other valid opinions. We accept them as being valid opinions if they go through the same rigorous approach. So it's not a you and me who don't even know Arabic sitting down and reading it and thinking, well, this is what it means, right? These are qualified scholars that have got ijaza to do this. They're mujtahid, and they're mujtahid in specific legal questions, or they can be mujtahids within a school of thought, or they can be complete or absolute mujtahids. So they can be mujtahid maslaha, mujtahid madhahib, or mujtahid mutlaq, right? So they, their ability to extract legal opinions, varies, right? So it's important that we leave the ijtihad to the mujtahids, right, who are qualified people to make this fatwa, right? And whether they interpret this literally or rationally, right? You can see even at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, you had this debate amongst the literalists and the rationalists, or those that later on we call Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, who take a more considered view, a holistic approach to to fiqh. So it's not just looking at the text and just focusing on the literal meaning. It's looking at the wider meaning in context. And even at the time of the Prophet, we had this conflict, and in the early generations it was there, and we see it amplified now. But the difference at that time was that the people there, the Sahabi, they didn't criticize the other group. So you had, in this incident of Banu Quraiza, you had the two groups of Sahabi differed on how they interpreted it. One group prayed, the other group didn't pray, and waited for them to finish. They finished, and then they traveled together, and then the other group prayed over there. They didn't criticize each other. They didn't accuse any of the other groups of being, kafir or anything like that. They accepted each other's opinions, right? And the Prophet ﷺ didn't criticize any of them, even though he knew which of the two he meant, or which was, which interpretation hit the bullseye, essentially, right? So differences of opinion are allowed as long as they are valid. And again, we've talked previously about why there are differences of opinion, why there is this ikhtilaf. Goes back to this question of its permissibility. You can see from Banu Quraiza, and there are lots of other issues around why ikhtilaf, differences of opinion amongst scholars, is allowed. They can differ in the sources of legislation, right? For example, the criteria for evaluating the authenticity of hadith, the sunnah, may be different. Therefore, some scholars will classify one hadith as sahih, others as hasan, others as perhaps mawdu' or daif, right? So the weighting they give to certain hadith will vary depending on their understanding. And for example, the hadith by Amr bin Shu'aib, mentions a woman that came to the Prophet ﷺ, along with her child and 2 gold bracelets in her hand. The Prophet ﷺ said to her, "Did you give zakat upon these?" And she said, "No." And then the Prophet ﷺ said, "Well, would you like it that Allah makes these into bracelets of fire?" Right, so that's a hadith. Some scholars think that is authentic. Other scholars think that is a weak hadith due to missing links in its isnad, in its chain. We talked about that before. Other really qualified scholars thought that was a weak hadith and disregarded it. And for them, they did not think it was right to pay zakah on jewelry, as long as you wear it. And you got the greats of Islam, including Aisha bint Abu Bakr, Imam Jabir, Ibn Umar, Imam Malik, Imam Ahmed, Imam Shafi. They considered that you didn't need to pay zakah on your jewelry. So they were aware of this hadith, but they discounted it, and they thought it was weak. They looked at other legislative sources, but they would always say, if you come across a strong hadith, right, of the Prophet ﷺ, disregard my opinion. If it contradicts my opinion, throw my opinion away and follow the hadith. For example, time of the Umar ibn al-Khattab, he did not permit ladies, from when they were having their menses, from performing tawaf. Based on this, Umar ibn al-Khattab, he forbade women from completing the Hajj even if they are menstruating, if their menses started after leaving Arafah. right, which is the most important day of the Hajj. And when he was informed that the Prophet ﷺ used to allow women to continue to perform Hajj under similar conditions, he then lifted the ban on those women and allowed them to complete their Hajj. So again, here you've got him, making his opinion based on the knowledge he knows. When he comes across hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, he puts his opinion aside and follows the opinion of the Prophet ﷺ. So again, that's why you can get differences of opinion in the way that the criteria people use to assess hadith varies. You can get a difference in the way some Sahabi used to give their opinions. So their understanding would vary. The scholars vary in their practice of qiyas, right? Analogy, right? Some scholars practice qiyas, others preferred istihsan, right? So it's again, scholars can come to different opinions because of how they do these, and scholars may even they all permit ijma as a source of law, but they differ in terms of what type of ijma, whether it's ijma sahaba, ijma al-Medina, ijma al-mujtahidin, right? Different types of, or ijma al-ummah, different types of ijma. So which one do you choose as a legislative source, right? Some scholars consider other things as valid legislative sources, such as maslaha mursala, whereas others say that's not a legislative source, that's a default in the absence of anything else, right? So hence you can get differences in the sources they use, you can get differences in the way they interpret the text. We've just talked about those who are literalists. Later on, some of these became called Zahiris, who refuse to take a deeper understanding of the text. They just look at it at surface value. For example, when Prophet put his fingers in his ears when there was music being played and he was walking with the Sahabi. So the literalists would say music is haram, whereas those who look at the deeper meaning would say, well, actually, he may himself personally not have liked that music, but if it was haram, he would have ordered the Sahabi to follow what he did. Okay, looking at deeper meanings. Okay, so again, so the differences in the way people interpret texts, differences, and we talked about in the methodology of usul or fiqh. Hence, you get the different schools of thought. For example, a classic thing, the beard. What is the definition of the beard? Generally, depending on the usul, how you derive opinions, some schools of thought think that growing a beard is fard, right? Like Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Hazm, they say it's compulsory for men, if they can, to grow a beard. Others say it's sunnah, like Ibn Qudama, Shawqani, Nawawi, Qadi Iyad. They said it's recommended, it's sunnah to have a beard. It's not fard, it's sunnah. Whereas some say it's mubah, it's permitted, like Qadi Abu Bakr, Ibn al-Arabi, and Imam Qurtubi. They say, look, you don't get any extra reward for growing the beard. You grow it, you don't grow it, it's permitted, it's up to you. Again, so that's again why you can get differences of opinion, differences in the way people understand the Arabic, and we talked about where Allah in the Qur'an says you should that the divorced woman should wait for 3 periods, 3 qurr, right? So you can get different understandings of that. And again, because of these differences, you've got these different schools of thought cropping up here. Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Shafi, Hanbali, Jafri, Zaydi, because they're the originators of that way of thinking and interpreting. Their students wrote down how their masters used the usul that they used. There were other scholars whose students weren't as prolific as writing down what the masters thought, how they interpreted things. So we've lost their schools because their students weren't as prolific. And Al-Awza'i, there's Hassan al-Basri, Sufyan al-Thawri, Ibn Jabir al-Tabari, and lots of others, really eminent scholars who weren't able to found schools of thought because their students didn't write down what they wrote. So that's essentially just wanted to say why we get differences of opinion, why we get ikhtilaf. And again, the incident of Banu Quraiza identifies that basically it is permissible to have difference of opinion in aspects of fiqh, jurisprudence, right? It's perfectly acceptable. It's on the principle of least amount of doubt, right? Or the highest probability that you've got the right answer, but you don't criticize other valid opinions from valid scholars who use a valid methodology, right? And unfortunately today you've got lots of people, lots of jahil people, especially here living in the West, over there in the West, not here in Pakistan. You still get those type of people here as well, who go shopping for fatawi, for fatwas, religious rulings. They're looking for people to say things that they want to hear, to give them the justification to do certain things, and then they can try to blame it on the scholar, right? And it doesn't work. Not on the Day of Judgment. The scholar will take the blame, but they will also take the blame if they follow that opinion for the sake of their own desires. If it's choosing the easiest way, the most convenient way, the way that they can keep their money the most, or big themselves up the most, right? Rather than the strongest opinion. Hence, we shouldn't play with legal opinions, as we will be judged on these on the Day of Judgment, either for us or against us, right? And we carry our own actions. Yes, if the scholar gets it right, he gets 2 rewards. If he gets it wrong, he still gets 1 reward. If he is deliberately twisting Islam and the hukam, he may get severely punished for that. Lots of hadith about that. And those people who follow that willfully, surely their punishment will be no less, because they willfully followed what they know to be a lesser opinion. Just because a scholar says it doesn't mean it obviates that it's true, or it mitigates their sin in any of that. So you follow the actions that you are sure, to the best of your ability, that what you are doing is the best way to please Allah on any given issue. That is the importance of following the right opinion, the right scholars, the right usul. Because at the end of the day, we want to get to the highest place in heaven. That's what it's all about. Just because differences of opinion are permitted, as we've seen in the issue of Banu Quraiza, doesn't mean we have the ability to shop around for the easiest opinion. We have to do what we think Allah wants us to do in that given situation, to the least amount of doubt, the highest probability. So I'll finish there. Gone well over time, but inshallah finished with the issue of Banu Quraiza. Again, Prophet did not punish the people because of who they were. They were punished because of what they did. And again, the legal implications of the story of do not play Asr until you get to Banu Quraiza. Really gone into more detail than I wanted to, but alhamdulillah, all knowledge is for the sake of Allah, all the good is from Allah, and if there are any mistakes, they are just from me. So do remember me in your du'as, do remember the ummah in your du'as, and if you do have any questions or comments or queries, WhatsApp me, Facebook me, YouTube me, or any other social media. And thank you for listening. Thank you for getting this far. And I'm sure only 1 or 2 people will get this far in terms of both the series and also today's session. So I really appreciate it if you have got this far, and thank you so much. And may Allah reward us all and grant us all the highest place in Jannah, inshallah. So I'll finish there then. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wa lasr innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilus salihati wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Jazakallah khair, everybody. Assalamu alaikum.